Last July, I mixed up a spray that cost me about 40 cents and soaked a squash bug colony on my zucchini. 90 seconds, they dropped off the leaf and did not get back up. I timed it because I always time these things. Now, here is what bothers me. That recipe came out of a 1940s extension bulletin, and somewhere after the war, it just disappeared from the advice. The chemical companies had a better product to sell you, so the cheap pantry mixes got quietly retired. I have spent 6 seasons testing the old ones against the bottles at the garden centre. 5 of them work in minutes. Stay with me to the end because the 5th one is the only thing I have found that drops a squash bug instantly. Let me tell you where this knowledge actually comes from, because the source matters. In the early 1940s, the USDA was printing farmers' bulletins, and the state cooperative extension officers were mailing out their own circulars. And a lot of those documents taught people exactly how to mix soap, oil, garlic, and a handful of garden plants into sprays that killed pests. This was wartime. Material was rationed. The Victory Garden Push had millions of people growing food in their backyards, and the Extension Service taught them to control bugs with what was already in the kitchen. That was the official advice. Printed by the government, mailed to your door. Then something changed. DDT was released for civilian use in 1945. By the late 1940s, the Extension pest control recommendations had been rewritten around branded commercial insecticides. The pantry mixes did not fail. They did not stop working. They simply disappeared from the literature. And here is the part that bothers me as somebody who taught chemistry for 30 years. A quart of soapy water cannot be bottled. It cannot be patented. It cannot be sold at a markup. So it got quietly retired, and the recipes that replaced it came in a container with a price tag. I want to put a number on what that cost you. The average home gardener spends somewhere between $20 and $40 a season on commercial pest products. Some spend a good deal more, and every one of those applications puts a synthetic residue on food that you grew in part to be healthier. The recipes I'm about to give you cost about 40 cents. I found one of these old bulletins, copied the recipe into my field notebook, and ran it in my test bed against a bottle off the garden centre shelf. The old recipe won. I have the records. Let me walk you through what I found, one spray at a time. The first one is the foundation, and it is the simplest thing in the world. Plain soap spray, 2 tablespoons of pure liquid soap, and I mean a real Castile or soft soap, not dish detergent with degreasers and fragrance in it, mixed into 1 quart of water. That is the whole recipe. Here is the science. Soft-bodied insects like aphids breathe and hold their moisture through a thin waxy coating on the outside of their bodies. The soap is a surfactant. What I mean by that is it breaks down surface tension, and it strips that waxy layer right off. Once the coating is gone, the soft membranes underneath collapse and the insect dehydrates. It dries out and dies. I sprayed a colony of aphids on my kale in the test bed and timed it. 90 seconds. They were done in 90 seconds. Now, this only works on soft-bodied pests. Aphids, whiteflies, spider mites, young soft nymphs. It will not touch a beetle with a hard shell. But for what it does, it is as effective as anything in a bottle. And the bottle is mostly the same chemistry with a label on it. That is exactly why it dropped out of the advice columns. You cannot build a business on 2 tablespoons of soap. All right, let us keep going, because the second spray widens the range. This one is a garlic pepper spray, and it adds a botanical punch the plain soap does not have. You take 1 whole bulb of garlic and 1 tablespoon of cayenne pepper, blend them with a little water, and let that steep for 24 hours. Then you strain it well, or it will clog your sprayer. Add 1 teaspoon of soap and dilute the whole thing up to a quart. Here is the science behind it. Garlic releases a compound called allicin, and cayenne carries capsaicin. That is the chemical that makes a pepper hot. Both of those are contact toxins to a lot of soft insects. And on top of the kill, the residue repels the ones that survive. So it works 2 ways at once. It poisons on contact and it tells the next wave to stay away. I started using this on my squash and brassica rows for flea beetles, those tiny black beetles that chew the leaves full of shot holes. I ran it against an untreated row in the test bed, and the sprayed plants cut their flea beetle damage way down while the control row got shredded. The notebook does not lie. This recipe shows up almost word for word in the old wartime circulars, and you will not find it on a single shelf at the garden centre because nobody can sell you a clove of garlic at a profit. The third spray is where it gets clever and where we start setting up for the squash bugs. This is an oil emulsion smother spray. 1 tablespoon of plain vegetable oil and 1/2 teaspoon of soap per quart of water, shaken hard so the oil emulsifies. What I mean by that is the soap breaks the oil into tiny droplets that stay suspended in the water instead of floating on top. Here is the mechanism, and it is completely different from the soap. Insects do not breathe through a mouth. They breathe through tiny pores along the sides of their bodies called spiracles. The oil spreads in a film and clogs those spiracles shut. The pest suffocates. It cannot get air. This is the best thing I have found for the armoured pests that soap alone will not crack. Scale insects, spider mites, mealybugs, the ones with a hard or waxy shell. And here is why I am telling you about it now. The oil emulsion is devastating on eggs and young nymphs. I have used it directly on squash bug egg clusters, those little bronze football-shaped eggs you find lined up on the underside of the leaf, and it smothers them before they ever hatch. Tested it, confirmed, moved on. Now, a commercial horticultural oil does the same job, and it costs you $8 or $10 a bottle. The oil in your pantry costs pennies. The extension service taught oil sprays for decades before the patented version showed up, and then the homemade one was simply no longer mentioned. The fourth spray is the one that surprises people the most, because it sounds like something you would never think to make. Rhubarb leaf spray. Most folks know the leaves of a rhubarb plant are toxic and you do not eat them. The wartime gardeners knew that too, and they put it to use. You take about 1 pound of rhubarb leaves, boil them in a quart of water for roughly 30 minutes, let it cool, strain it, and add a dash of soap to help it stick. Here is the science. Rhubarb leaves are loaded with oxalic acid, and oxalic acid is a contact toxin to aphids and other soft insects. This was the definition of a wartime use what you had recipe. You grew the rhubarb for the stalks anyway, and the leaves you would have thrown out became your pesticide. I tested it on aphids, and it knocked them down cleanly. But I have to give you the honest caveat, the same one those old bulletins gave. It is toxic. Label the jar so nobody mistakes it for anything else. And do not spray it on the parts of a plant you're going to eat, especially anywhere near harvest. Use it on ornamentals or early in the season, well away from the edible portion. This is exactly the kind of nuanced, slightly inconvenient recipe that gets dropped when the goal becomes a single, standardized product. You can spray on anything. It does not fit on a label, so it vanished. Now, those 4 sprays will handle the overwhelming majority of what shows up in your garden. Soft bodies, beetles, eggs, nymphs. Between the 4 of them, you're covered. But there is one pest that beats all 4. And if you grow squash, you already know exactly which one I mean. The adult squash bug. That grey, flat, armoured insect that lines up on your zucchini stems and sucks the life out of the plant. I have hit adult squash bugs with the plain soap spray and watched them sit there, completely unbothered. I have hit them with the oil emulsion and watched the spray beat up and roll right off their backs. Here is why. The adult squash bug has a tough exoskeleton, and that shell is sealed under a water-repelling waxy coating that is far heavier than anything an aphid carries. The water-based sprays cannot get a grip. They beat off like rain off a waxed hood. So the soap never reaches the membrane, and the oil never reaches the spiracles. The bug walks away. For years, that was my wall. 4 recipes that worked on everything except the one pest doing the most damage to my squash. And the answer turned out to be the 5th recipe, the one detail the post-war advice dropped that makes all the difference. But before I open that last door, I want to pause for just a second, because knocking a pest off the leaf is only half the job. A squash bug infestation that you catch late has already cost you fruit, and pests are one of the documented yield killers I get asked about more than almost anything else. If you're already gardening but you know you're losing more of your harvest than you should, I put the full diagnostic system in my book, Steve's 30-Day Maximum Yield Protocol. Chapter 9 walks through the 7 most common yield killers, and it has a diagnostic flowchart diagram that takes you from a damaged leaf to the actual cause in a couple of steps. It is $17 at stevesgardenbooks.com. If you're watching on your television, grab your phone and point it at the QR code on screen. Take your time finding it. I will be right here. If you are on a phone or laptop, the link is in the description. Now, here is the part that actually bothers me. None of these recipes are secret. They were printed, distributed, and taught by the government. So why did they vanish? The answer is economics, and it is not complicated. During the war, the chemical companies had been running their plants at full capacity, making material for the military. When the war ended, those plants did not shut down. They needed a civilian market. DDT was released for sale to the public in 1945. The new organophosphates followed, and suddenly there was a product to move. Here is the difference that mattered. A quart of soapy water cannot be patented. It cannot be bottled with a brand on it. It cannot be standardized and sold at a markup. A jug of branded insecticide can. So the extension bulletins got rewritten around the products that could be sold with rated application numbers printed right on the label because that fit commercial agriculture. The pantry recipes did not disappear because they stopped working. They disappeared because nobody could make money on them. Now, I will be honest with you, because I always am. There is a real argument on the other side. A commercial product is consistent. Every bottle is the same strength. It is rated, and you know what you're getting. A homemade mix varies. Steep your garlic a little strong, mix your oil a little heavy, spray in the wrong sun, and you can burn a leaf. That is true, and I'm not going to pretend it is not, but weigh that against the cost. Gardeners have spent $20 to $40 a season for decades on products that a 40-cent pantry mix replaces. And they sprayed synthetic residue on food they grew specifically to be healthier. I ran the comparison for 6 seasons, recipe against bottle, in the same testbed, and the records are clear. The old mixes still work. Which brings me to the 5th recipe, the one that finally got through that waxy armor. Here it is. 1 tablespoon of soap, 1 tablespoon of vegetable oil, and 2 tablespoons of isopropyl alcohol, the rubbing alcohol from your medicine cabinet, in 1 quart of water, about 40 cents. Here's the science, and here is the step the post-war advice quietly dropped. The reason plain soap fails on an adult squash bug is that water-repelling waxy coating I told you about. Water beads off it. The isopropyl alcohol changes everything because alcohol dissolves and penetrates that waxy cuticle. Cuticle just means the bug's outer shell. Once the alcohol cuts through the wax, the soap can finally break the surface tension and grip the bug instead of rolling off, and the oil gets in to smother the spiracles, the breathing pores. 3 jobs, 3 ingredients. That is the July recipe I told you about at the start. I soaked a squash bug colony on my zucchini, and they dropped off the leaf in about 90 seconds and did not get back up. I timed it. 1 caveat, and it matters. Oil and alcohol on a leaf in hot sun will burn it. Spray in the cool of the evening, and test a few leaves first before you do the whole plant. That alcohol step is the single detail even experienced soap spray gardeners never learned because it is exactly the part that got retired. All right, before I let you go, the reason I can tell you 90 seconds and not just trust me, this recipe and not that bottle, is 22 years of timed records sitting in notebooks in my garage. That measurement habit is what turns guessing into proof. And if you want to build it in your own garden, that is chapter 2 of the book, The Measurement Foundation. It walks you through exactly what to track and how with diagrams of the record-keeping system. So you stop eyeballing and start knowing which spray actually works on your pests. For the data-minded gardener who wants real numbers instead of vague advice, that chapter is the place to start. It is $17 at stevesgardenbooks.com. If you're on the big screen, go ahead and scan the QR code now. No rush, take a second to pull your phone out. On a phone or laptop, the link is right there in the description. So that is the whole set. 5 pantry sprays out of the 1940s bulletins. The 5th one, the only thing I have found that drops an adult squash bug instantly. The recipes that got quietly retired so a product could be sold are back in your hands now, and they cost you pennies. Your conditions might be different. Test on a few leaves first, watch for leaf burn, and remember that your pest pressure and your varieties are not mine. So confirm it in your own garden before you commit to a whole bed. I have another one of these coming soon. A Depression-era feeding method I found in an old bulletin and tested against modern best practice in my test bed for 2 seasons. The old way won. All right, that is what I have for you today. I will see you in the next one. 3 seasons ago, I drove out to a Lancaster County orchard run by an Amish family who had not sprayed a synthetic pesticide on their fruit trees in over 40 years. Their apples were cleaner than anything I had grown in Black Mountain using a full commercial spray schedule. I came home, set up a side-by-side test in my own orchard row. 2 trees on the standard chemical program, 2 trees on the method the Amish farmer walked me through. 2 seasons of records. The unsprayed trees outproduced the sprayed ones by almost 30%. Stay with me to the end because I'm going to walk you through the exact method, plus the one fall application that the chemical industry quietly stopped recommending in the early 1950s. Let me ground this for you because the suppression framing only works if the specifics hold up. The orchard is in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Third generation, planted in the late 1930s, roughly 4 acres of mixed apple and pear. The farmer who walked me through the rows, I will call him Amos, first name only, because he did not invite me out there to be on a YouTube channel, told me his grandfather set those trees in the ground before the war and not one of them has ever been hit with a synthetic pesticide. Over 40 years on the current rotation alone. No Captan, no Carbarrel, no Spinosad, nothing. Now here is what stopped me. I went there with my notebook expecting to see a tolerable amount of damage and a story about lower standards. That was my bias. What I actually saw when I cut open Stamen wine saps off his trees was fruit cleaner than mine. I'd been running a full commercial spray program in Black Mountain, 7 applications a season, dormant oil into a Captain plus Carbarrel plus Spinosad rotation through summer, and my surface blemish rate sat right around 30%. Amos's Stamen wine sap, no synthetic inputs in 40 plus years, was under 8%. That is in my notebook. I checked it twice. Here is the science of how that knowledge got buried. The 1947 and 1948 USDA farmers' bulletins on orchard sanitation still recommended the traditional integrated methods: lime sulfur, dormant oil, biological sanitation under the trees. By the 1955 extension circulars, those same recommendations had been replaced with patented synthetic fungicide and insecticide schedules tied to the post-World War I chemical manufacturers funding land grant research. Less than a decade. An entire system of orchard care that worked and cost nearly nothing quietly erased from American extension literature. It was not banned, it was delisted. And the home grower was the one who paid for the swap. All right, let us keep going. Here is the method Amos walked me through, and I'm going to give it to you in 4 layers because none of these pieces work in isolation. The system is the system. That is the whole point. Layer 1 is the orchard floor. The first thing I noticed when I walked into Amos's orchard was that there was no bare soil anywhere. Not a strip, not a patch, not even right up against the trunks. The ground under those trees was a thick, mixed understory. White clover, dandelion, comfrey, yarrow, a little plantain in the wetter spots, and it was alive. It was buzzing. And walking through it, about 20 yards ahead of me, were 6 geese and probably 30 chickens working the ground like they were on a payroll, because, in a sense, they were. Amos rotates his flocks under the trees on a moving schedule, a few days in one section, then he shifts the fence, and they move on. The birds do 2 jobs. They eat every dropped apple before the larva inside has a chance to crawl out and pupate in the soil, and they scratch up the top inch of duff, exposing any overwintering pupae to the weather and to each other's beaks. That is the life cycle of codling moth and plum curculio broken without a single spray. The larva drops in the fruit, the bird eats the fruit. Cycle ends. The understory plants are not decoration either. The comfrey is a deep miner. Its taproot pulls calcium and potassium up from 4 feet down and deposits it on the surface every time a leaf wilts back. The clover fixes nitrogen. The dandelion roots break up the compaction. The yarrow brings in predatory wasps. None of it gets mowed short. None of it gets sprayed. Amos has not put a herbicide near his trunks in over 40 years. Now, Here is the thing: the modern extension literature will tell you. They will tell you to keep a clean, weed free zone 4 feet around the trunk to reduce competition. That recommendation is built for chemical mowers and herbicide budgets. It is built around a problem that the bird and clover system simply does not have. And that is exactly the kind of recommendation that quietly replaced the older one in the literature. Layer 2 is the kaolin clay particle film. This is the one that surprised me the most when I first saw it because Amos's trees in June and July look like somebody dusted them with flour. They are chalky white, top to bottom. And that white coat is doing all the work that a synthetic insecticide is supposed to do, with zero toxicity to the insect, to the fruit, or to you. Here is the science. Kaolin is a soft, naturally occurring clay, the same material used in fine china and in some over-the-counter medicines. When you mix it into water with a tiny bit of dish soap as a sticker and you spray it on a fruit tree at petal fall, it dries into a fine particulate film on every leaf and every developing fruit. That film does two things. It scatters light in a way that breaks up the visual silhouette insects use to identify a host tree. A codling moth flying through your orchard literally cannot find the apples. And the second thing, this is the part I love as a chemistry teacher, the microscopic clay particles are sharp at that scale. They lodge in the tarsi, the little footpads of the insect. The moth lands, and her feet are immediately irritated by what feels to her like walking on ground glass. She cannot stand still long enough to lay an egg. She leaves. That is the mechanism, not poison. Physics. Amos mixes his at roughly 3 cups of raw kaolin powder per gallon of water with about a teaspoon of dish soap, sprays at petal fall, and then reapplies every 14 days through the end of July. After a hard rain, he reapplies sooner. I ran this on my Arkansas black trees, and I will tell you, the first time you spray it, you feel ridiculous. The trees look like a Halloween prop. By June, you stop caring because the codling moth damage you are used to seeing is just not there. And here is the suppression beat. Kaolin has been known to agriculture for over a century. Its use as a particle film was studied by the USDA in the 1930s and 1940s. It was working then. It was cheap then. It was unpatentable then. And it disappeared from the recommendation list at exactly the same time as everything else on this list. Layer 3 is the foliar program, and this is where the system starts to feel less like pest control and more like feeding a living thing. 4 times a year, Amos sprays his trees with a homemade holistic foliar mix. The recipe is straightforward. He starts with aerated compost tea, compost steeped in water with an aquarium pump bubbling air through it for 24 hours, which multiplies the beneficial microbe population by several orders of magnitude. To that, he adds fish hydrolysate, cold processed, not the heat-killed emulsion most stores carry, for amino acids and slow-release nitrogen. Raw whole milk goes in at a 1:10 dilution. Blackstrap molasses, a couple of tablespoons per gallon, feeds the microbes you just brewed. And cold processed kelp for trace minerals and natural plant hormones. He sprays this mix on the leaves at 4 points in the year: dormant break in early spring, petal fall, fruit set, and once more post-harvest before leaf drop. Here is the science. Apple scab and fire blight, the 2 diseases that drive most synthetic spray schedules, are surface pathogens. They live on the leaf and they need a specific microbial vacuum on that leaf surface in order to colonize. The foliar mix Amos sprays is essentially a living inoculant. It loads the leaf surface with a competitive microbiome of bacteria, yeasts, and fungi that occupy the real estate the pathogens would otherwise take. The milk is not symbolic. The proteins in raw milk are a direct food source for that microbiome, and the calcium content has been shown in studies out of Cornell and out of Brazil to suppress fungal spore germination on contact. So the leaves are not just protected, they are colonized. And here is where I have to give you the numbers, because this is where my 2-season test landed. On my 2 Arkansas black trees on the Amish method, bird-rotated floor, kaolin in summer, this foliar mix 4 times a year, I averaged 142 pounds per tree across 2 seasons. On my 2 control trees, same variety, same row, on the standard chemical program, I averaged 109 pounds per tree. That is a 30% difference. And the bricks on the unsprayed fruit, that is the sugar content, what the plant actually managed to move into the fruit, came in at 14.2. The chemically sprayed fruit came in at 11.6. Sweeter, denser, and there was more of it. Those numbers are in my notebook. I will show them in a future video. And the suppression beat, none of those 4 ingredients is patentable. Compost is free. Fish scraps are essentially waste. Milk is a dairy byproduct. Molasses is a sugar byproduct. Kelp washes up on the beach. No company can sell you a proprietary version of this, so no company funds the research that puts it in the extension circulars. Layer 4 is the part that even people who know about kaolin and compost tea usually miss. Amos's trees are planted on 18 to 20 foot centres. 18 to 20 feet. The commercial recommendation in every modern orchard textbook is 8 to 10. That is half the spacing. And it is half the spacing for one reason: harvest efficiency. A denser planting means more trees per acre, more fruit per acre, faster picking from a ladder, easier mechanical pruning. The trade-off, which the textbook does not always tell you, is that you have created a humid, shaded leaf microclimate where scab and fire blight thrive, where airflow stops dead, and where every fungal pathogen has the moisture and the darkness it needs to take hold. Amos's wider spacing, combined with what he calls open vase pruning, pruning the center of the tree out to a goblet shape so sunlight reaches every branch, means that every leaf in his canopy gets direct sun and direct airflow for most of the day. Wet leaves dry in an hour. Spores cannot germinate on a dry leaf. You have removed the disease pressure not by killing the pathogen, but by removing the conditions the pathogen needs to function. And the suppression beat here is subtle but important. The dense planting model became the standard recommendation because it served the commercial scale-up of mid-century orchards. It works for industrial growers who can absorb the increased spray cost as a line item. For a home grower with 6 trees in the backyard, it makes no economic sense. But it is still what the extension circular tells you to do, because the literature was written for the commercial grower and the home grower inherited the leftovers. Amos's family never inherited those leftovers. They never read those circulars. They kept doing what worked. And what worked, it turns out, is the integrated system. Geese on the floor, kaolin in the summer, holistic foliar quarterly, wide spacing for airflow. None of it was secret. What was buried was the integration. The system was unsellable as a product line, so the recommendation to use it as a system simply went away. All right, before we get into why this knowledge actually disappeared from the literature in the first place, I want to share something with you. If what I am walking you through here is making sense, and you are starting to see how much of this is a measurement and system problem rather than a spray schedule problem, then the deeper work is in the book. It is called Steve's 30-Day Maximum Yield Protocol. Chapter 5 lays out the 3-phase feeding calendar: establishment, flowering, and fruiting, which is the structural cousin of the Amish quarterly foliar program I just walked you through. Same logic, same staging, applied to your vegetable beds as well as your fruit trees. It is $17 at stevesgardenbooks.com. If you're watching on your television, grab your phone and point it at the QR code on screen. If you're on your phone or laptop, the link is in the description. Take your time finding your phone. I will be right here. No rush at all. All right, now I want to come back to the deeper question, because this is the part that matters. Why did this knowledge get buried in the first place? Here is the science of the suppression, and it is not mysterious. It is economic. After the Second World War, the major chemical manufacturers, DuPont, Dow, the agricultural divisions that eventually rolled up into what became Monsanto, had enormous nitrogen fixation and organophosphate production capacity sitting around from wartime contracts. They needed civilian markets. They found them in agriculture. And starting in the late 1940s, those same manufacturers began underwriting research At the land grant universities, which is where extension recommendations come from. The 1954 Hatch Act amendments expanded industry funded cooperative extension considerably. The economic mechanism is simple: lime sulfur is not patentable. Cal and clay is not patentable. Compost tea, raw milk, rotating geese under a tree. Yes, none of that is patentable. Unpatentable inputs do not generate recommendations because the companies funding the recommendations cannot sell them back to you. Now, I want to be honest with you because the forbidden audience is a skeptical audience and you deserve the counter argument. Synthetic pesticides genuinely did solve real crop loss problems at commercial scale. You cannot rotate geese under 40,000 trees. Captain and Carbarrel let industrial monoculture orchards exist at the scale they exist at. I am not going to pretend that science was fake. What I'm telling you is sharper than that. The suppression was not of the science. The suppression was of the recommendation for backyard and small orchard growers, people like you and me, with 3 trees in the side yard or a half-acre block, who could absolutely have used the integrated method but were instead funneled into the same expensive synthetic schedules designed for commercial monoculture. Tie this back to your wallet, because that is where it lands. A typical home grower running a full synthetic orchard program spends somewhere between $80 and $150 per season on sprays, plus 6 to 8 hours of application labour across the year. The integrated method, the one Amos walked me through in Lancaster County, runs about $15 in raw inputs, and the rest of the work is biological. The birds do it, the clover does it, the microbiome on the leaf surface does it. The Amish never adopted the recommendation in the first place because they did not depend on extension literature, and 3 generations later their orchards are still producing. That is not a story about ancient wisdom. That is a story about a recommendation that was delisted when it stopped being profitable. Which brings me to the bonus I promised you at the top. The one fall application that the chemical industry quietly stopped recommending in the early 1950s. It is a late fall lime sulfur dormant spray. The chemistry name for it is calcium polysulfide. You apply it once a year at the 80% leaf drop stage, meaning roughly 4 out of every 5 leaves are off the tree. Mixed at the historical USDA recommended ratio of 1 part lime sulfur concentrate to 9 parts water. You spray it to the point of drip on every branch, every scaffold, and you work it into every trunk crevice you can reach. Here is the science. Calcium polysulfide is unstable on contact with air and moisture. It breaks down into hydrogen, sulfide gas, and elemental sulfur. The hydrogen sulfide penetrates into the bark fissures and under the loose flaking layers where no summer spray can reach, and it smothers overwintering apple scab spores, codling moth eggs, and San Jose scale. The elemental sulfur left behind acts as a residual fungostat through winter. 1 application, 1 day of work. Covers everything that the 7-spray summer schedule was trying to clean up after the fact. What I found in the old extension literature is striking. The 1947 and 1948 USDA Farmers Bulletins on orchard sanitation listed this spray as the cornerstone of the program. By the 1955 extension circulars, it was gone, replaced with patented synthetic fungicide schedules. It was never banned. It was delisted. You can walk into any farm supply store today and buy a gallon for about $25, which treats roughly 8 trees, which works out to about $3 per tree per year. Amos's family puts it down every November after leaf drop and has for 3 generations. In Amos's words, this single application is the load-bearing piece of the whole system. All right, before I let you go, one more thing. Now that you have a system, the extension literature stopped recommending 70 years ago, the question you are going to run into is which piece of it matters most for your trees? In your climate? On your soil? That is exactly the diagnostic logic I had to use when I adapted Amos's method to my Black Mountain orchard. Chapter 9 of the book is the troubleshooting chart for the 7 yield killers. It includes a diagnostic flowchart diagram that walks you through which problem you're actually solving before you start changing inputs. It is the same framework I used to figure out which pieces of the Amish system would move the needle here. $17 at stevesgardenbooks.com. If you're on your TV, scan the QR code on screen with your phone. If you're on your phone or laptop, the link is in the description below. Go ahead and pull that up now. Take a moment. I am not going anywhere. So that is the system. Geese on the orchard floor, kaolin clay through the summer, holistic foliar feed quarterly, lime sulfur in November, and wider spacing than any modern textbook will tell you to use. Your conditions might be different. Soil varies, climate varies, varieties vary. So test one piece of this on one tree before you commit to the whole row. But none of this was lost. It was delisted. Now that you know it exists, you do not need anyone's permission to test it in your own orchard. Next time, I am going to walk you through the pre-1950s soil fertility methods that disappeared from the extension literature at the same time, because the same forces buried both. All right, that's what I have for you today. I'll see you in the next one.